Imagine an empire so vast and powerful that it didn't just conquer land, it wiped entire cultures from existence. The rise of the Islamic caliphates was not merely a military campaign, it was a systematic erasure of civilizations. But what happened to the millions who resisted this expansion? What became of those who refused to convert, those who stood firm against this wave of transformation? The true stories buried deep within history have been largely forgotten, hidden by time, misinterpreted by history books, or deliberately erased. But today, we will uncover the horrifying truths that few ever speak of, from systematic child abductions to the complete destruction of entire cultures and religions. The Islamic conquests were not just about land or power. They were about breaking the spirit of every civilization they encountered. These were not isolated events, but part of a calculated and brutal campaign that spanned centuries. The men, women, and children caught in the wake of this force experienced a fate so devastating it redefined entire societies. Stay with us as we reveal the untold stories of those who suffered and those who disappeared forever, fates that were shaped by the brutal methods of conquest. And today we're diving deep into a chilling, often overlooked chapter of history, the systematic destruction of civilizations during the rise of the Islamic caliphates. These empires, celebrated for their advancements in science, mathematics, and culture, left a shadow of devastation behind them, a shadow that still looms over the lands they conquered. The stories of the millions who resisted, who refused to bend to the tides of religious expansion, have been largely silenced, buried by the passage of time and political interests. But those stories are not lost, they're waiting to be told. While most history books shine a light on the Islamic Golden Age, they fail to mention the cost of that golden era, the millions who lost their identities, their families, and for some, their entire way of life. Entire civilizations were erased in a blink, their cultural landmarks destroyed, their histories rewritten. These weren't just wars, they were systematic campaigns of cultural annihilation, forcing people to surrender not just their land but their very souls. For those who resisted conversion, the consequences were severe. They were often wiped out from history, not just through death, but through forced assimilation, psychological manipulation, and the violent erasure of their cultures. In this documentary, we will uncover the disturbing truth behind these conquests. You'll hear the forgotten stories of the people who stood in defiance of this unstoppable force and the unimaginable lengths they went to in order to survive. The caliphate's conquests were not just battles for land, but for the soul of entire peoples. Get ready to journey through one of the most harrowing eras of history, where conquest went beyond the battlefield and became a relentless campaign to erase the very fabric of ancient cultures. The rapid expansion of the Islamic caliphates in the medieval period changed the course of history in ways that still reverberate today. From the 7th century onward, the caliphates extended their reach from the Arabian Peninsula to vast swathes of Europe, Africa, and Asia. While history often celebrates the period as a time of intellectual enlightenment, the flourishing of science, mathematics, philosophy, and culture, this golden age was built upon something much darker. Behind the grand achievements in astronomy and algebra, a brutal system of conquest was taking place. The caliphates didn't simply expand their borders through military victories, they imposed a cultural and religious hegemony that sought to obliterate the existing societies and replace them with an Islamic order. These conquests weren't just about power or territory, they were systematic campaigns to erase entire civilizations, making the world's oldest cultures vanish beneath the weight of religious and political dominance. The strategies they used were not just military. They involved psychological manipulation, forced assimilation, and relentless violence, often disguised as the inevitable spread of a superior civilization. The rise of these empires ushered in a period of profound upheaval for those caught in their wake, and for many the loss wasn't just physical, it was spiritual and cultural. While the caliphates were thriving, those who resisted their expansion were facing an entirely different reality. The regions that were conquered, such as the Balkans and parts of North Africa, endured a devastating transformation. What had been vibrant and diverse societies were forced into submission through violent conquests, where resistance was met with brutal retaliation. These territories, once home to distinct cultures, languages, and religions, were now under siege by a military force that sought not only to dominate, but to erase their very existence. In the Balkans, Christian villages lived in constant fear of being raided by Ottoman forces, and in North Africa, ancient civilizations like Egypt and Carthage were subsumed by an Islamic empire that swept across the region. But the most insidious part of this expansion wasn't the battlefronts, it was the psychological and cultural dismantling that followed. The caliphates didn't just occupy the land, they sought to break the spirits of the people by destroying their sense of identity. This was more than military subjugation, it was cultural genocide, and the human cost was immeasurable. The Ottoman Empire's policies of conquest took a particularly brutal turn with the introduction of child trafficking and the systematic creation of slave armies. Under the Devshirme system, Christian boys, some as young as 8 years old, were forcibly taken from their families, never to return. These boys, chosen for their physical strength and intelligence, were forcibly converted to Islam, cut off from their native cultures, and subjected to intense military training. The trauma inflicted on these children was immense. They were not only ripped from their families, but also stripped of their very identities. In a cruel twist, many of these boys, now rebranded as elite Janissaries, went on to fight the very people they had once called family. But the psychological warfare didn't end there. The Ottoman authorities understood that breaking the spirit of a people was far more effective than merely occupying their land. By taking the brightest and strongest from the conquered villages, they ensured that entire communities were left vulnerable, devoid of their most capable sons, who would otherwise have become leaders or resistors to the empire's influence. This practice left generations of people traumatized and disconnected from their heritage, as their sons were transformed into soldiers of the empire, fighting not for their families, but for an oppressive system that had stolen everything from them. The Islamic caliphates, especially the Ottomans, were not content with simple military conquest. They sought total domination, erasing the very fabric of the civilizations they overran. Their expansion was methodical and far-reaching, driven not only by the desire for land and power, but by a strategic, multi-dimensional system of conquest. In the early centuries, as the caliphates expanded from the Arabian Peninsula, they absorbed vast regions stretching from North Africa to the heart of Europe. But this territorial growth was not an end in itself. The caliphates understood that mere military victory over a region was insufficient to secure control. To ensure the survival and dominance of their empire, they systematically targeted the cultural, religious, and social identities of the peoples they conquered. The expansion of the Ottoman Empire in particular exemplified this method. Under the guise of spreading Islam, the Ottomans practiced a form of domination that sought to erase the past, rewrite the future, and forcefully replace ancient beliefs with a singular Islamic worldview. Entire cultures were left reeling under the weight of this imperial conquest, religions were abolished, temples and churches destroyed, and people were systematically indoctrinated into the new regime. The legacy of this period is not only one of military conquest, but one of cultural erasure, where entire civilizations were wiped off the map, not by war alone, but by the total annihilation of their traditions, beliefs, and heritage. At the heart of this expansion was psychological warfare that went beyond traditional battle tactics. The caliphates understood the power of not just occupying land, but also breaking the will of the people. To truly control a region, it was not enough to conquer and rule, it was necessary to make the conquered people believe their culture, religion, and history were inferior. The caliphates did this through a sophisticated and brutal method of psychological manipulation. By eradicating religious institutions, demolishing sacred sites, and undermining local customs, they effectively wiped out the identity of their subjects. But this wasn't just about physical destruction, it was about creating a sense of cultural insignificance. Forcing millions into submission, the caliphates didn't just occupy land, they stole lives and erased entire belief systems. Religious conversions were not merely a matter of faith but of survival. To resist was to risk death or exile, to lose one's community, and to have one's cultural identity obliterated. This process created generations of people who in many cases were disconnected from their own past, forced to adhere to a new set of beliefs and practices that were foreign to their heritage. The psychological toll was immense, and it resonated across generations, leaving deep scars in the conquered territories. One of the most brutal and effective methods of psychological control employed by the Ottomans was the dev-shurme system. This practice involved the forced conscription of Christian boys from the Balkans who were taken from their families, often at a young age, and converted to Islam. These boys were not merely conscripted into the army, they were subjected to a complete transformation, physically, emotionally, and culturally. The Ottomans perfected this system as a way to strengthen their military while simultaneously eliminating potential resistance from the local population. Christian families were required to give up their sons, often under threat of violence or death, knowing that once their children were taken, they would never return. The boys were forced into rigorous military training and indoctrinated into Islamic beliefs, but the psychological impact of this practice was profound. These boys, who had been torn from their families, communities, and religions, were not just soldiers, they became living symbols of the Ottoman Empire's control. Many of these boys rose to positions of power within the army, becoming elite soldiers known as janissaries, loyal only to the Sultan. But in the process, they had been stripped of their original identities, forced to forget their roots, and made to see their former families and cultures as enemies. The dev-shurme was not just a military strategy, it was an assault on the very soul of entire communities. And the lasting effects of this brutal system would continue to haunt the Balkans and other conquered regions for centuries. The dev-shurme was not a mere tax, it was a blood tax, a horrifying practice that saw Christian boys torn from their families and forcibly converted to Islam to serve the Ottoman Empire. This practice, which began as early as the 14th century, involved the systematic collection of young Christian boys, often as young as 8 years old, from villages throughout the Ottoman territories. These boys were taken from their homes, far from the protection of their families, and subjected to rigorous indoctrination. Forced to embrace a new identity, a new faith, and a new loyalty, these boys were raised to serve as elite soldiers in the Sultan's army, known as the janissaries. The training was harsh and brutal, but it went beyond physical endurance. It sought to erase their Christian identity entirely. These children were not just conscripted into military service, they were reprogrammed. Their original names were stripped away, their languages suppressed, and their familial ties severed. In the eyes of the Ottomans, these boys were a powerful tool, a method of reinforcing control over the conquered regions. The dev-shurme ensured that the strongest and most promising boys became loyal soldiers, fighting for the empire that had enslaved them. The impact of this system was profound, not just on the boys who were taken, but on the entire cultural fabric of the regions they came from. It was a systematic effort to convert not just a population, but an entire generation, erasing the old and replacing it with a new singular loyalty to the Ottoman state. For the families of these boys, the toll of the dev-shurme was unimaginable. Parents, often powerless to resist, were forced to watch as their sons were taken away. This wasn't a voluntary recruitment, it was an abduction. Fathers and mothers who had raised their children with love and care were made to stand helplessly as the Ottoman officials selected the strongest boys for the Sultan's service. The pain of watching their children taken, often with no promise of return, was exacerbated by the terrifying knowledge that resistance would bring death, not just to the child but to the entire family. Any attempt to defy the Ottoman soldiers was met with brutal force. Families who tried to hide their sons or protect them from this fate were often executed and their homes burned. The psychological toll was immense. It wasn't just the physical loss of a child, but the mental anguish of knowing that their loved ones were being raised to become warriors for an empire that had destroyed their way of life. The trauma didn't end with the boys' departure. The entire community was left to live in constant fear, knowing that the next sweep could take more children, more sons. The dev-shurme system wasn't just a military draft, it was an instrument of terror, a tool to break the spirit of entire communities. And in the process, it left behind a generation of children who were both victims and agents of a foreign empire, torn from everything they had known. The scale of the dev-shurme system was staggering, and its impact extended far beyond the initial years of its operation. From 1365 to 1826, it is estimated that between 500,000 and 1 million boys were taken from their families and forced into the service of the Ottoman Empire. This was not an isolated practice, but a widespread and systematic operation that spanned centuries. Whole regions of the Balkans, including modern-day Greece, Albania and Bulgaria, were subjected to this policy, with villages living in a state of perpetual fear. The Ottoman authorities implemented regular sweeps, during which officials would travel from village to village, selecting boys based on their physical strength and intelligence. This constant cycle of abduction created a climate of fear and submission. Parents had no choice but to comply, knowing that resistance was futile and would lead to devastating consequences. The psychological strain on these communities was unimaginable, one of helplessness, sorrow and terror. The Devshirme wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a long-standing policy that operated for over 500 years. Entire generations were affected, and the practice became an integral part of the Ottoman Empire's ability to maintain control over its territories. The legacy of the blood tax continues to haunt the historical memory of the Balkan regions, a reminder of the brutal cost of empire and the human suffering that fueled it. The Ottomans' conquest went beyond the battlefield. It infiltrated the very fabric of society. One of the most insidious aspects of their empire building was the systematic child trafficking operations, which were cleverly disguised as a tax collection system. Under the guise of the Devshirme, Ottoman officials would collect Christian boys from their families, stripping them of everything that defined them, their names, their faith, and their cultural identity. What began as a military strategy slowly evolved into a fully integrated system of human trafficking, used not only to fill the ranks of the Ottoman army, but to break the spirit of entire communities. Families, often living in fear, had no choice but to surrender their children to this cruel practice. The boys, taken away from their homes and forced into the service of the Sultan, were transformed into tools of conquest. These boys, once full of potential, were no longer children, but instruments of the empire's expansion. Their innocence was robbed as they were reprogrammed, mentally and physically, to serve a foreign and oppressive regime. This process of child abduction wasn't just about creating soldiers, it was about erasing entire lineages and using the most vulnerable members of society as pawns in a game of political and religious domination. The lasting consequences of this systematic trafficking were felt not just by the boys, but by their families, who would never again see their children, and by the larger communities that were left without their young men, who might have once fought to preserve their culture. The brutal reality of the Devshirme was that these stolen boys were raised to view their families as the enemy. Through psychological manipulation, the Ottoman Empire successfully turned the very children they had taken into loyal servants of the Sultan. The boys, forcibly converted to Islam, were taught to believe that their Christian families had abandoned them and that the Sultan had saved them from ignorance and violence. The Devshirme wasn't simply a method for creating soldiers, it was a psychological tool designed to ensure loyalty and break the spirits of the conquered people. These children, once torn from their homes, were given new names, new histories, and new allegiances. The Sultan was not just their ruler, he was their savior, and any remembrance of their past lives, their homes, and their families became foreign to them. They were raised in barracks, indoctrinated into the imperial system, and trained to serve with absolute loyalty. The boys were subjected to brutal physical and mental conditioning, which included not only military drills, but a systematic erasure of their past identities. The deeper the psychological manipulation, the more loyal the boys became to the system that had enslaved them. Over time, many of these boys grew up to be the most formidable warriors of the empire, but at what cost? Their entire understanding of their own humanity had been rewritten, and they fought not for their families or their homes, but for an empire that had turned them into something other than human, a tool to enforce its will. The Devshirme's true cruelty lay in how the Ottomans used these converted, indoctrinated boys to further their conquest, particularly by turning former Christians into agents of oppression against their own people. By taking the brightest and most promising children, those who could have grown into leaders, scholars or resistance fighters, and turning them into elite soldiers, the Ottomans weakened the very communities they had conquered. These young boys, raised as janissaries, became instruments of a greater cycle of destruction. They were sent back into the lands they had come from, not as sons of their villages, but as elite soldiers for the Sultan. Their presence not only added to the Ottoman military strength, but also served as a psychological tool to further subjugate their former communities. The families and villages that had once been their own were now the enemy, and the boys who returned, now hardened, loyal to the Sultan and culturally alienated, were used to quash resistance. The cruelty of this system was evident in the psychological warfare it waged. The very people who should have been fighting to protect their homes were now complicit in their destruction. This systematic eradication of cultural and religious identity meant that resistance was not only physically impossible, it was psychologically impossible as well. The Ottomans turned these once promising children into instruments of oppression, using them to suppress any hope of rebellion, ensuring that the conquered peoples would never rise up against the empire. The legacy of the Devshirme was not just in the soldiers it created, but in the deep scars it left on the communities it devastated. The cycle of oppression became self-perpetuating, and the very systems that had once been symbols of hope and resistance were now tools of imperial dominance. The conquest of the Islamic caliphates went far beyond military supremacy. It was a calculated campaign of cultural genocide, a deliberate attempt to erase entire religious systems and histories. The Ottomans, alongside other caliphate forces, didn't just seek to occupy territory, they sought to eradicate the very foundation of the cultures they encountered. One of the most tragic aspects of this conquest was the systematic destruction of ancient religions. In Egypt, the rise of Islam saw the once thriving Coptic Christian community decimated. The Copts, who had been the majority in Egypt for centuries, found themselves marginalized and attacked. Temples and churches were destroyed, and Coptic Christians were forced to either convert to Islam or suffer the consequences. The impact wasn't just religious but cultural. Ancient Christian texts and knowledge were lost forever. This destruction wasn't isolated to Egypt. In Persia, the Zoroastrian religion, which had shaped Persian identity for over a millennium, faced a similar fate. Zoroastrian fire temples were extinguished, and sacred texts were burned or discarded. The priests were either forced to convert or executed, and the religion, which had once been the heart of the Persian Empire, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a broader strategy to replace ancient belief systems with the new monotheistic rule of the caliphates. The caliphates knew that to conquer and control was not just to defeat armies, but to suppress the very beliefs that had shaped societies for centuries. The cultural erasure that followed these conquests has left scars that still echo through history, wiping out religious practices, philosophical traditions, and entire ways of life. But the destruction wasn't only spiritual, it was economic. To solidify their power, the caliphates imposed harsh taxes and trade restrictions that devastated the economies of conquered territories. One of the most significant financial burdens placed on non-Muslims was the jizya tax, a crippling poll tax that taxed non-Muslim populations simply for maintaining their religious beliefs. For many families, this tax was more than just a financial burden, it was a tool of oppression. It often amounted to months of wages, leaving families impoverished and struggling to survive. But the jizya was just the beginning. The caliphates further eroded local economies through severe trade restrictions. Non-Muslims were often prohibited from engaging in certain types of commerce, forcing them to either accept meager roles in the economy or abandon their livelihoods altogether. Economic success, once driven by diverse, thriving local markets, now became an impossibility. Merchants from conquered territories were often taxed disproportionately or excluded from trade networks entirely, while Muslim elites were given favorable treatment, further entrenching economic disparities. This created a cycle of dependency, where the conquered populations were not just financially impoverished, but also systematically excluded from economic power. Farmers were subjected to excessive land taxes, and agricultural productivity plummeted as regions struggled to recover from the financial devastation. Resistance to the caliphates was not only impossible on the battlefield, it became financially unsustainable. Families were driven into debt, communities were torn apart by the economic strain, and any hope of rebellion was suffocated by the weight of poverty and despair. The legacy of this cultural and economic destruction has endured long after the caliphate's dominance faded. From Alexandria to Persia, entire libraries, monumental religious structures, and centuries of cultural heritage were erased, leaving only traces of what once was. In Alexandria, the Great Library, a beacon of knowledge that had attracted scholars from across the ancient world, was destroyed. Its priceless manuscripts, containing the collective knowledge of the ancient world, were lost in the flames of conquest. The destruction of the library wasn't just the loss of books, it was the loss of knowledge that had shaped civilizations for centuries. Similarly, in Persia, the libraries of the Sasanian Empire, which housed not just religious texts but works of philosophy, science and history, were systematically burned. The cultural treasures of ancient civilizations were swept away in the name of religious and political conquest, replaced by the new structures and ideologies of the caliphates. This cultural erasure wasn't limited to physical destruction, it extended to the very memory of these civilizations. Monuments, temples and palaces that once stood as symbols of cultural pride were repurposed or destroyed, their histories rewritten or forgotten. Whole cities, once vibrant centers of learning and culture, were left in ruins, with their legacy erased from the historical record. The result was a world that became more homogeneous, one in which the diversity of human culture, religion and thought was diminished. The Ottoman Empire, in particular, left a legacy of erasure, where entire ways of life were replaced by a singular, dominating ideology. And while the caliphates may no longer hold power, the scars of their conquests continue to shape the societies they once ruled, leaving behind the remnants of civilizations that were once rich in culture, knowledge and faith. Islamic slave trade, spanning over 1,000 years, stands as one of history's most horrific and systematic operations. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade, which is often remembered for its brutal transportation of Africans to the Americas, the Islamic slave trade was marked by unique and horrifying practices, including the widespread castration of male slaves. The demand for young castrated boys was so intense that entire industries were dedicated to the inhumane practice. These boys, primarily captured from regions such as Africa, Central Asia and the Caucasus, were subjected to castration before or upon arrival in Islamic lands. The procedure, often performed without anesthesia, was highly dangerous, with a staggering mortality rate estimated at 80 to 90%, making it a death sentence for most victims. Those who survived, however, were often left permanently marked, unable to have children, and forced into a life of servitude. These men were considered less than human, unable to reproduce, and relegated to roles that preserved the slave system for future generations. The castrated boys were primarily used for military service or as palace servants, with many being trained to serve in the elite military units like the Mamluks or the Ottoman Janissaries. Their status as castrated slaves ensured that they could not rise above their assigned role, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation and powerlessness. Entire generations of men who were once potential leaders, scholars or warriors were erased from history, their futures stolen and repurposed to maintain an empire built on human suffering. While the castration of men dominated the Islamic slave trade, women suffered a different but equally brutal fate. Women, particularly those from regions like Africa, the Balkans and Central Asia, were captured and sold into slavery, but their use was primarily as concubines, sexual property to satisfy the desires of the elite. These women were often forcibly removed from their families and subjected to a life of exploitation and abuse. The psychological and physical toll on these women was unimaginable. Once captured, their lives were no longer their own. They became possessions of the wealthy and powerful, traded in markets much like livestock. They were forced to live in harems where their sole purpose was to provide sexual service to rulers or wealthy men. Many were used as concubines, and their children born of these relationships were often treated as illegitimate, with little to no rights or future prospects. The trauma experienced by these women was not just physical but emotional. Ripped from their homes, forced into sexual slavery, and denied the possibility of forming their own families. In some cases, women were kept until they became undesirable to their masters and were then discarded, left with no future. The treatment of these women as sexual property reflects a dark chapter in the history of slavery, where exploitation wasn't limited to forced labor. It was extended to the complete dehumanization of women, reducing them to mere tools for pleasure and reproduction. The economic devastation wrought by the Islamic slave trade was not limited to the exploitation of labor. It was a calculated effort to eliminate the possibility of future resistance by ensuring that enslaved populations could never form stable, independent communities. One of the most insidious aspects of this system was that enslaved people were forbidden from forming families. Male slaves, particularly those who had been castrated, were unable to reproduce, thus ensuring that the supply of slaves would never dry up. In many cases, the forced labor and sexual exploitation of enslaved populations served the dual purpose of creating a constant demand for new captives, fueling a never-ending cycle of slavery. Families, once an important part of the social structure in many of these regions, were systematically destroyed. Slave women were prevented from marrying or creating any form of familial bond with their captors. As a result, the enslaved were isolated, their lives devoid of any support structure or sense of continuity. The inability to form families meant that they could not pass on cultural traditions or knowledge to future generations, leading to a cultural disintegration that extended beyond economic slavery. Entire generations were raised in captivity, unaware of their heritage, and without the emotional and social tools to resist the system that enslaved them. The system of slavery within the Islamic caliphates wasn't just about labor exploitation, it was about the systematic erasure of community, culture, and the very idea of resistance. By ensuring that enslaved people could not create families or communities, the caliphates maintained a constant supply of vulnerable individuals, all too ready to serve the empire's needs, without any hope of freedom or independence. The conquest of the Islamic caliphates was not limited to military or economic dominance. It was an all-encompassing campaign aimed at the obliteration of cultural identities. The caliphates didn't just conquer territories, they systematically erased the very essence of the civilizations they defeated. One of the most insidious tools in this process was the forced imposition of the Arabic language. Arabic, the language of the Quran and Islamic governance, was established as the dominant language in every region the caliphates controlled. The original languages of the conquered peoples, Coptic in Egypt, Persian in Iran, and the myriad languages of the Indian subcontinent, were suppressed. In many cases, speaking these local languages was seen as a sign of resistance or disloyalty, and those who continued to use them were often punished. This was not just a linguistic shift, it was a cultural erasure, as the local identities, histories, and worldviews tied to these languages were slowly stripped away. Alongside this linguistic dominance came the renaming of cities. Places that had existed for centuries, bearing names that reflected the culture and history of the people who lived there, were renamed with Arabic titles. Cities such as Alexandria in Egypt and Ctesiphon in Persia, once vibrant centers of ancient civilization, lost their original names, becoming symbols of the caliphate's dominance. This wasn't just a superficial change, it was an effort to sever the link between the people and their past, to rewrite history in a way that served the empire's ideology. The renaming of cities was an outward sign of the empire's success in erasing the very identities of the populations they had conquered. The cultural history of entire civilizations was left in ruins, their identities subsumed under the weight of Arabic supremacy. The impact of this cultural genocide extended deeply into the arts and education. The caliphates not only obliterated the religious and social structures of the conquered peoples, but also attacked the intellectual and artistic legacies that had defined them for millennia. In Egypt, once home to the world-renowned Library of Alexandria, the caliphates burned the Great Library, destroying an irreplaceable repository of knowledge. For centuries, Alexandria had been a hub of learning, where scholars from around the world gathered to study and share ideas. The library housed countless texts, from scientific treatises to philosophical works, many of which were never copied or translated. The destruction of this intellectual center was a symbolic blow to ancient Egyptian culture, and its loss was felt across the ancient world. Similarly, in Persia, the great libraries of the Sasanian Empire, which had accumulated knowledge over centuries, were burned in the wake of conquest. Persian intellectual traditions, including Zoroastrian philosophy and science, were deliberately wiped out, and those who attempted to preserve them were often executed or forced to convert. The same pattern was repeated in India, where the intellectual and artistic achievements of ancient civilizations were systematically destroyed. Temples, universities, and cultural institutions were razed, and the wisdom they contained was lost forever. The loss of these treasures wasn't just an aesthetic or academic tragedy, it was a brutal effort to erase the foundational ideas and cultures that had shaped these regions for centuries. The destruction of libraries and schools was a calculated strategy to sever the intellectual roots of these societies, making it harder for future generations to reclaim or even remember their past. The once great civilizations of Egypt, Persia, and India were left with only fragmented remnants of their intellectual legacies, buried beneath the weight of an empire that sought to replace their histories with its own narrative. As we've explored today, the Islamic caliphates created one of the most efficient and widespread systems of conquest and cultural destruction in history. Their empire was not just built on military victories, but on a deliberate campaign to erase entire civilizations, leaving behind a legacy of broken communities and lost histories. From the systematic destruction of religious systems like Coptic Christianity in Egypt and Zoroastrianism in Persia, to the obliteration of intellectual legacies in the great libraries of Alexandria, the caliphates went beyond territorial control. They sought to dominate the very identities of the peoples they conquered, erasing languages, traditions, and cultures that had flourished for millennia. The impact of these conquests was not just physical, but deeply psychological, leaving generations disconnected from their past, their beliefs, and their cultural roots. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think of the methods used by the Islamic caliphates to conquer and destroy entire cultures? Was it just a byproduct of empire building, or was there a deeper, more sinister agenda at play? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this documentary eye-opening and believe these stories need to be told, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a deep dive into history's darkest secrets. Stay tuned because we'll continue uncovering the hidden stories that shaped our world.